Now let's discuss question types that you can see while attempting questions on critical reasoning. Now the first question type you would find is that you would be required to identify the assumption. I mentioned previously that assumptions are typically not stated. Yeah, so a question could very well ask you, they could give you a premise and a conclusion along with all the other stuff, background, etc. And then they could ask you to identify the key assumption, right? So that's the first question type you could see. The second question type you could find in a critical reasoning argument is to identify a conclusion. Now, I have mentioned previously in this video that conclusions are an absolute must for an argument, right? So while that is true, sometimes the conclusion itself may not be given, right? So which means that you would be given a premise, you would be given something akin to an assumption or an assumption, and you would be required to figure out what the conclusion of the argument is, okay? Because obviously without a conclusion, the argument is not complete. The third kind of question you can find in critical reasoning is that you would be required to identify the role of a sentence in the argument, right? So the argument would have sentences related to background, sentences which are giving you a premise, sentences which are sometimes even giving you an assumption or a conclusion. You would be required to identify the role of that sentence in the argument, right? So that's the third kind of questions you can see in critical reasoning. Now, once you've you've done your um, the breakup of all of these sentences, you've identified each and every sentence's role. You may be asked to strengthen or weaken the argument, right? So you may be asked to identify out of a given set of statements which statement strengthens the argument and which statement weakens the argument. Now, strengthening and weakening, right? Typically, the best way of strengthening or weakening an argument is to attack or to support the assumption. These are typically strengthening or weakening the assumption of the argument. Because let's say, I mean, in the given question, in the example that we've been talking about, if you were to attack the premise, it's rather flimsy. For example, the example argument that we've been discussing, look at that boy and girl, right? Now what if I attack the premise itself and say, oh no, they're not a boy and a girl, they're both girls or they're both boys, right? So what I've done is I've attacked the premise, but that's a very frivolous way of attacking an argument. Typically, a classy way of attacking the argument is to attack the assumption. Okay, so that's what these questions relate to. Now, based on whatever we've discussed, we have learned how to identify the assumption, right? Because you would recall the assumption is typically, if the premise in general is true, then the conclusion in general must be true. We have also learned to identify the role of a sentence in the argument, right? That's these two things we've already done. Now let's look at some of the other question types. I think that there's one more question type that I can add to here, and that is finding the flaw in the argument. Yeah, so finding the flaw again is finding inconsistencies in the assumption itself. Okay, so let me call it the sixth one. So these three are what we will discuss in a little bit of detail, because we have learned how to identify the assumption. We have learned to identify or derive a conclusion also in our previous discussion. In the discussion so far, we have identified the role of each sentence in the argument. We've done this also. Now we'll talk about these three types: strengthening, weakening, and finding the flaw in the argument, right? So let's just recall our argument again. The argument was, we went to watch a movie, we saw a boy and a girl. Jenny said they were friends, and I thought they were lovers and would get married soon. We had identified the role of each and every sentence in this argument. Yeah, I'll just quickly move on. Let's talk about weakening the speaker's argument. Now, if we are required to weaken the speaker's argument, right? What if I said this? In this part of the country, lovers typically do not go out on a movie date. right? So you remember the speaker's argument. The speaker's assumption was any boy and girl, they are lovers and they'll probably get married soon, right? But if I say that in this part of the country where, you know, we've gone to watch this movie, lovers typically do not go on a movie date. So how could they be lovers? The couple that we see, they could not be lovers, sir. So what I've done is, by stating this, I have weakened the speaker's assumption and hence the speaker's argument, right? So this is how we weaken the speaker's argument. All right, let's move on. Let's uh, while we are weakening an argument, right? So some basic theory around it. We just have to undermine the conclusion. Okay, so I mean, I could well have said in this part of the country that lovers generally do not go out on a movie date, right? So this is good enough to undermine the conclusion. If I had said in this part of the country lovers never go on a movie date, then I have destroyed the argument. Okay, but what we are looking for is, we are looking for statements that weaken the speaker's argument, not necessarily destroy it. So even in this part of the country, lovers generally do not go out on a movie date is a good enough statement to weaken the argument. Okay. All right, and these are some of the pointers, some of the words that you'll find in the questions, which will tell you that you're required to weaken the argument, right? So you'll see words like which of the following statements attacks the speaker's argument, or undermines the speaker's arguments, or argues against the speaker, and so on and so forth, right? So you can take note of these words. All right, moving on. Let's talk about strengthening the speaker's argument, right? So like I said previously, strengthening the argument, we will typically try to consolidate the speaker's assumption. Okay, so let's say if I were to say, in this part of the country, a boy asks a girl out for a movie only if he's in love with her and wants to propose to her, right? So if that is the case, and you know, and that's what typically happens, then yes, then whatever speaker says makes a lot of sense, right? The speaker's argument is strengthened. Why? Because this is what typically happens, right? So this statement has strengthened the speaker's argument, right? Right. So while we are strengthening, right, we must only consolidate on what the speaker has assumed. Okay, it need not be that I mean, a statement like, in this part of the country, only lovers who are engaged to get married, right, they go out on a movie date. Then yes, then what I've said is, I've completely made the assumption 100% certainty, right? But that need not be so. You may not be required to make it 100% certain. You are just required to consolidate, right? So maybe increase the percentage. If let's say what the speaker said was maybe 50% true, the statement adds up another 20% to it. Yeah. So that's how you strengthen the speaker's argument. Again, you strengthen the speaker's argument by strengthening the assumption that the speaker has made, right? So this is again some of the words that will help you identify the question, which is asking you to strengthen the argument. Which of the following most justifies what the speaker is saying, or supports what the speaker is saying, or strengthens what the speaker is saying? Okay. All right, now the third kind of questions that, you know, that are relevant to the assumption, right, is finding the flaw in speaker's argument, right? So finding the flaw is basically, again, you're attacking the assumption and you're finding if there's any logical holes in what has been assumed, right? So clearly one of the logical holes has already been pointed out by the counter conclusion, right? So what Jenny had said, she had said they could be friends, but no, I said no, I am quite sure that they are lovers, they're not just friends, right? So if we were to list out all the things that could go wrong in what the speaker has assumed, it is what Jenny says, this boy and girl could be friends, or they could be related, right? They could be boy and a girl, you don't know them, right? So they could be the boy and girl could be brother sister, they could be cousins, right? Or they could be classmates, for all you care, right? The third possible flaw is that they could already be married, right? You don't know that. You don't know whether they are married or not. You just assume that they are lovers who will get married, right? So If they're already married, then obviously that's a flaw in what the speaker has assumed. Another way of finding the flaw, another flaw in the speaker's argument here is that they may not be alone at all, right? So they're probably a part of a bigger group, and the group has got their seating somewhere else, and they had just these two seats in another corner, and both of them are sitting there. So there's no question that they are alone and they're lovers and they would get married soon. So all of these are possible flaws in the speaker's argument, right? So I'll just very quickly summarize what we've discussed. We've discussed what an argument looks like, what is the structure of an argument, right? And then we went on to identify each and every part of the argument, right? So each and every sentence is contributing, or every part of the sentence is contributing in certain way to the argument, right? So we have helped identify that. And then we have gone on to discuss the question types, right? Which range from identifying what the argument is, identifying what kind of what sentences, what the role of each sentence is in the argument, or for that matter, finding the flaws in the argument, or strengthening, weakening the argument,